Good day, and thank you for joining, and welcome to you all to another consultation by the Asian Development Bank. This is part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer it to. This is the 9th consultation in our total series that runs up to about April 2022. It's nice to see so many colleagues joining us again in the new year. For those of you joining for the first time for this CSO-led Stakeholder Engagement, Information, Disclosure, and Grievance Redress Mechanism consultation, a warm welcome again and a very good day to you all. My name is Azim Manji, and I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is the 4th in this series of consultation on stakeholder engagement, information disclosure, and grievance redress mechanisms, which for your ease and our ease, we will simply refer to as stakeholder engagement or SEID, or maybe even SEED for short. In today's SEED or SEID CSO-focused consultations with stakeholders from Southeast Asia, East Asia, and some parts of the Pacific, we have 46 of 72 registered participants who are from outside the ADB system. And we expect this number to grow in the first few minutes of this consultation. As I mentioned, this is a consultation with civil society and other non-governmental actors from Central and West Asia and South Asia, but we're happy to be joined by participants from Southeast Asia, East Asia, as well as other regions, as I mentioned. We especially want to highlight the participation from representatives in Uzbekistan, who have 9 registered members for this consultation. We're also glad to see the presence of stakeholder representatives who joined our previous consultations. As always, we welcome new participants in these consultations and look forward to your insights, on-the-ground views, and recommendations. Just briefly, some of the country representations, and forgive me if I don't mention them all, are as follows. From South Asia, we have Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. From Central and West Asia, we have Afghanistan, Armenia, Georgia, and Uzbekistan, as I mentioned. From Southeast Asia, we have Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand represented, and other regions, Canada, Netherlands, Russia, Switzerland, the UK, and the USA. In this consultation, the ADB will present its study that compares the ADB's policy on SEED or SEID with the key authors of this study. From the presentations, we're hoping participants like you will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the policy. And we also look forward to hearing your views on how to propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standard on stakeholder engagement. Before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle reminders. Firstly, if you could join from a quiet, distraction-free area, would help us hear you and hopefully also help you hear us. Please turn off your microphone and video when not speaking. During the Q&A and moderated discussion session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked to unmute yourself and turn on your video camera so you can ask your question live. A reminder to be respectful to everyone and also be respectful of the time to ensure we can all keep to the schedule. IT support is provided. If you run into an issue, please type your issue in the chat box and one of our team members will be happy to support you. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important buttons. As I mentioned, simultaneous interpretation is available. To access this, click on the globe icon found at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the preferred language you wish to have interpretation in. Once you do that, don't forget to press the mute original audio button so that you can clearly hear the language of your selected interpreter. For today's consultation, we have interpretation available in English, Russian, Hindi, and Urdu. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To do this, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, where you will see on the right-hand side of the screen your name. Look for your name, click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. When you click Rename, type in your name and the agency you represent. You may even wish to put your designation or your position from the agency in that name box. You can also introduce yourself to us by typing your name, designation, and agency in the chat function. If you wish to send us a message, question, or feedback, or share experiences, click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Look for the reaction button if you wish to raise your hand. In the reaction button or the smile icon, you will see an emoji for raise hand. If you do so, you will notify our moderator, Gelson Garcia, that you wish to make a contribution. When you're asked to do so by Gelson, please unmute yourself and click the microphone on to show your video by clicking the video icon. As always, we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So allow me to restate ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. The Safeguard Policy Review and Update is now in phase 2 of its consultations, and these consultations are intended to provide opportunities for stakeholders like yourselves to express your views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. Stakeholders are encouraged to articulate your inputs and concerns during the consultation sessions. As you will have seen when joining, these will be video recorded as well as documented. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to any comments and inputs made. Background materials have already been shared and released to you and will continue to do so throughout the course of these dialogues and consultation sessions. All types of feedback are welcome. I assure you these will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination. Session documentation summarizing the feedback will be disclosed throughout the consultations process. This ensures the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. If you have any issues or concerns on the confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through safeguardsupdate@adb.org. That email address is being flashed in the chat box now. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours. Here's what we have planned to maximize your time and our time. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide welcome remarks, a quick overview and approach to the SPRU, as well as frame and contextualize this SEED or SEID study. Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Secondly, Ms. Zahuri Hairapetyan will present an overview of ADB's Stakeholder Engagement study, including the study summary, some overview findings, and a comparative analysis with multilateral finance institutions, or MFIs. She will also lead into some of the initial areas for further consideration and emerging issues. Zaruhi is a social development specialist in the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. We will then have a presentation by the study's co-author on the findings and key issues and identifying ways forward and providing a bigger picture that leads us into the discussion on the stakeholder engagement policy. This is being delivered by Elizabeth Mann, the lead social safeguards specialist and a consultant for the SEID. We also have on hand Mr. Mike Beecham, who is here today and has provided inputs into the study that will be presented by Zaruhi and Liz. Mr. Beecham is a principal social development specialist with the ADB. Following these presentations, we'll have a brief 5-minute break where Mr. Gelson Garcia will moderate our Q&A session that runs for about 75 minutes and possibly a bit longer if necessary. Gelson is the Senior Stakeholder Engagement Specialist with the SEP team and the Secretariat. Mr. Garcia will prompt you with guide questions to frame the conversation. After the Q&A and during the break, we will have a lead-in to event evaluation questions before turning you back to Mr. Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and an indication of the next steps as well as what lies ahead for us between now and April of 2022. As such, and with that overview, I would like to now call upon the Director, Mr. Bruce Dunn, for his welcome remarks and overview. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and good day and welcome, and thank you to all of the participants joining today. Really pleased to be here with you for this regional consultation on stakeholder engagement, information disclosure, and grievance redress mechanisms, or SEID, as you'll hear us refer to it in this session for short. I'll speak a little bit slowly during this opening remarks just for the benefit of the translators. Now, this regional consultation is the 9th thematic consultation topic that ADB has held as part of the Safeguard Policy Update process. We started in November last year, and we'll actually be continuing with further consultation topics between now and May 2022 this year. And we're planning to cover about 20 thematic topics in total. And of course, we run these sessions at different times. You can find further information on the program on our website, and we'll be putting the links available for you in the chat today. And we also wanted to let you know that we'll very soon be releasing further dates for consultations that are not updated on the website yet. I apologize that we've had some delay in getting the website updated, but that will be soon fixed. Now, for today's consultation, I'm very pleased that we've got a wide range of participants joining from civil society and non-government organizations, mostly from South Asia and Central and West Asia countries, as Azim has mentioned. But of course, wherever you're joining from, we very much welcome your participation, and we look forward to your very active engagement in the discussion and the Q&A session today. Now, quite a number of you have joined previous consultation sessions, and that's always excellent to be able to see you again and to continue the dialogue. But of course, some are joining always for the first time, and for that group, I'd like to just provide a little bit of background for these sessions. Now, ADB launched the update of the review and update, I should say, of the Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short, following an evaluation of the effectiveness of the Safeguard Policy by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department. And that study by the Independent Evaluation Department had recommended that after more than 10 years, ADB should update and modernize the policy. And it's expected that the policy update will be implemented over a 2.5-year period. And we're targeting approval of the new policy by March 2023. So we have about 15 months ahead of us still to undertake further regional consultations, and that will then feed into the development of the draft policy itself. And following that, of course, we'll be launching further stakeholder consultations on the draft itself. Now, for today's session on SEID, on stakeholder engagement, it's really arguably one of the most critical and important topics for the entire Safeguard policy. We need to ensure, of course, that projects do not adversely affect people, communities, and the environment. And that's indeed one of the key objectives of the existing safeguard policy statement. And to do that, really, you can only be effective if you have the inclusion of all relevant stakeholders and affected people in the process. Now, this includes, of course, engaging early with people, sharing and disclosing information, conducting meaningful consultation, and really trying to understand how projects would impact stakeholders and integrating their views and concerns into the project design and management and implementation of projects, as well as involving them in the entire process, and finding ways to be able to hear their concerns and grievances through project grievance redress mechanisms, or GRMs, as you might hear people refer to it during this session. So this is absolutely critical. And we have had a number of studies undertaken by the ADB that consider stakeholder engagement and meaningful consultation as part of the implementation of safeguards. And we have a number of experiences and lessons from those that we'll be sharing with you today. In these opening remarks, though, I wanted to share just some perspectives from that. The most recent study, as I've mentioned, is the independent evaluation of the SPS from 2020. And it actually found that while the majority of projects achieve satisfactory consultation at the project appraisal stage, so this is when projects have been prepared prior to ADB board consideration. However, it was found that information disclosure and consultation throughout project implementation was weaker and needed to be strengthened. And also there were generally some weaknesses in ensuring that the consultation process was truly meaningful and effective. So, you know, here, and I think this is something that many of you agree from civil society, and I'm sure we'll hear from you today, you know, it's not about just holding consultations. It's not just about sharing information. It's really about making sure that that whole process is meaningful. And you will hear more about that during the presentations today. Now, in addition to that evaluation study, we also had a ADB joint learning report on the accountability mechanism. This is something that we prepare every 3 years as a joint effort from the two offices of ADB's accountability mechanism. So that's the office that deals with compliance review, as well as the office that supports problem solving for affected people. They come together with the Independent Evaluation Department and our Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, which is the office that I sit within with the Safeguards Division. So the last report jointly between us all was in 2019, and we actually reviewed the complaints that ADB had received through the accountability mechanism. And one of the key findings of the study was that the most significant challenges that we find that lead to cases being raised to the accountability mechanism are often linked in some way back to challenges within the consultation processes or weaknesses in the consultation processes, as well as to the functioning and effectiveness of grievance redress mechanisms. And of course, this can lead to obviously issues and impacts or concerns that are being overlooked, as well as possible delays and cost overruns for projects. So, you know, both for people as well as for the sound implementation of projects, this is clearly something that, you know, we all have a concern and a need to address. Now, that report led to a number of recommendations that are all very relevant to this policy update process, clearly strengthening participation and meaningful consultation throughout the project cycle, also improving complaints tracking and the development of further risk management systems within the ADB, as well as work with our developing member countries and clients on building good practices and capacity for well-functioning grievance redress mechanisms. So moving forward, we need to take these recommendations and of course others into account to get the new policy right, while also strengthening the implementation side. And there are, in fact, a number of areas that we are already considering for the new policy. Of course, you'll hear more about this again in the presentations. And I just want to mention a number of the key ones, particularly the high-level ones at this stage, that you'll be hearing more about. First is the development of a dedicated standard on stakeholder engagement, information disclosure and grievance redress mechanisms. So we feel that it's very important to bring together some of the, if I'm honest, I will say more fragmented information about requirements for stakeholder engagement and consultation within the existing policy. We want to consolidate and develop that further. Then secondly, we see a clear need for strengthening guidance, building capacity and ownership of our developing member countries, and also strengthening support for monitoring and implementation. Third, we need to ensure that consultation processes are more targeted towards a range of different stakeholders. We need to ensure that they have good coverage of poor and vulnerable households, needs to be gender sensitive with the involvement of women and girls. We also need to look at engagement of youth and children. We need to engage with respect to Indigenous people and other cultural sensitivities. And of course, there are a range of other stakeholders, for example, people with disabilities, sexual and gender minorities, and a range of others that need to have consideration through the stakeholder engagement process, as well as for greater customization of grievance redress mechanisms. Then fourthly, grievance redress mechanisms is something that I've mentioned a number of times, and clearly they need to be strengthened. And this is something that we're looking into, and we'd like to hear more from you today. Now, this is obviously targeted towards the policy update, but I wanted to mention there are some areas that we're working on already. We are in the process of preparing some good practice guidance for grievance redress mechanisms, which would feed further into policy level guidance once we have the new policy. And we're also in the process of developing what we're calling an integrated safeguard management system for ADB, as an online tool to track and manage the portfolio and to manage also our responses to complaints. Plus, we would like to have more sophisticated analytics on our safeguard policy and the implementation of the policy. So this is something that we're actually in the process of now building the IT system for pilot testing this year and roll out as part of the new policy. So many things that are currently under consideration, and of course, many issues for us to consider further as part of the new policy and as part of today's consultation. So with that, very much looking forward to hearing your feedback, to getting your recommendations. Of course, we're interested in existing challenges, and we'd like to hear from you in terms of specific needs for strengthening the policy. Now, with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleagues now. Firstly, Ms. Zaruhi Harapetian, she's going to be presenting on the existing safeguard policy statement and some of the findings of the IED studies. And then after that, we'll be turning over to Ms. Elizabeth Mann, who's going to be presenting on the analytical study, including the benchmarking. So I'll hand over to them for the presentation. So over to you, Zaruhi. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bruce. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today with you, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and your willingness to help us with your views, suggestions, advices during the SPS update process. With this session, with this particular presentation, we would like to support our further discussion during the moderated session. and to present briefly some fundamentals on the SPS and particularly policy principles related to the stakeholder engagement, consultations, grievance redress mechanism, and information disclosure. Some findings and recommendations on the implementation of those principles outlined in the review conducted by ADB's independent evaluation department. And at the end, briefly to introduce you the methodology we adopt for the stakeholder engagement studies, which is the analytical foundation for us for the SPS update and development of the standard. Next slide, please. So as you may know, SPS was approved in July 29, and it's effective since 2010, and it covers three main policy areas on environment, involuntary settlement, and indigenous people. There is no any special standard on stakeholder engagement, but the principles related to consultations, GRM, and information disclosure are reflected across all three safeguards areas and annexes. Next slide, please. I would like to highlight main principles and procedures for consultation, disclosure, and GRM, which are listed here for the reference to use during our discussion later today. So existing SPS requires meaningful consultations to be conducted with affected people, with indigenous communities, with host communities, and concerned non-government organizations. The meaningful consultations should begin early and should be carried out throughout the project cycle. The process of the consultations should be gender inclusive and responsive, and it should be tailored to the needs of vulnerable groups. What is really important, all relevant views should be incorporated into the decision making. Related to the grievance redress mechanism, policy requires a project level GRM to be developed, and it should be scaled to the risks and adverse impacts of the project. It should also be gender responsive and sensitive. It should be culturally appropriate, readily accessible at no cost and without retribution, and it should use understandable and transparent processes. Next slide, please. I would like to share some special disclosure requirements. So there is a requirement to disclose a draft environmental assessment and resettlement plan in a timely manner, and a draft full environmental impact assessment at least 120 days prior to ADB board consideration. Disclosure of monitoring reports on ADB website, and what is very important, disclosure of relevant information from the monitoring reports to affected people. If the provision of broad community support for IP safeguards triggers, ADB will assure itself that broad community support for the project has been demonstrated by the IP communities. Next slide, please. Bruce already mentioned about independent evaluation department report, which provides findings not only SPS implementation in general, but particularly on stakeholder engagement, information disclosure, and GRM, on the level of project implementation and on the policy level. You can find the link to the report in the chat, kindly added by our team. In general, report indicates weaknesses in stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultations, timely disclosure, and functioning of project-level GRM. Limited stakeholder consultation, especially during implementation, is a key contributory factor to safeguard compliance cases. ID report provides rating of 172 projects. Adequacy of ADB processes and systems on appraisal stage was rated as 84% for consultation and participation, quite high one, and almost 64 for appraisal stage information disclosure. And this low disclosure rate is partially influenced by client confidentiality clauses in non-sovereign operations. As for implementation stage, adequacy rate consultations and participation is a bit lower. It's near 55%. The evaluation also found limited evidence of effective local disclosure. And I guess we will discuss this today as well. On the policy level, ID report underlined limited guidance in the SPS on how to make consultations and GRM effective and how to monitor the effectiveness of consultations and GRM. It also mentions that disclosure requirement of 120 days is not aligned with other MFIs, which is particularly sensitive for non-sovereign operations. Next slide, please. Based on the findings, ID report also provides recommendations, which we consider useful to look at during SPS update process and also during moderated discussion. Liz will provide more details on the recommendations. Just to have an understanding of the direction, I will list main recommendations, particularly adoption of integrated approach, development of a separate policy standard for stakeholder engagement, inclusion of stakeholder engagement plan as a safeguards instrument, consideration of shorter disclosure requirements, particularly for non-sovereign operations, and improvement of guidance materials and training approaches to staff and the borrowers. With last slide, next slide, please. With this last slide, I would like to turn to the policy update process, particularly for the stakeholder engagement component. To make an informed recommendations to policy update on stakeholder engagement component, ADB already started analytical studies, particularly comparative study on the requirements of different MFIs related to stakeholder engagement and GRM, including World Bank, IFC, EBRD, IDB. The team also is reviewing existing evaluation reports, accountability mechanism examples. We are conducting a study on Grievance Redress Mechanism implementation in the projects, and findings of those reports are in the process of extensive discussions internally within ADB. This series of consultation meetings with developing member countries and with civil society will allow us to collect external inputs on the main findings. And now I would like to pass over to my colleague, Elizabeth Mann. She will present the initial findings of the background research and discussions we had so far. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Zara, and welcome to everybody else, and thank you for joining today. The next presentation is really to make a comparison between the existing provisions for stakeholder engagement planning, for grievance processes, and for information disclosure that are there under the Safeguard Policy Statement, compared with those provisions under other international financing institutions, and specifically the ones that were mentioned by Zara already. So that's IFC, EBRD, IDB, and the World Bank. There are three main elements of this presentation because there are additional issues, as both Zara and Bruce have pointed out. It's a very multifaceted topic, and there are lots of elements to it. But I've focused this morning, or today, sorry, because it's not morning for a lot of you there, I have focused on the three main elements of the stakeholder engagement planning, grievances, and information disclosure. There are other components, clearly, like monitoring, evaluation, and resource allocation, which I'm sure some of you will want to raise. But just for the sake of brevity, and because I know that you're all experienced development practitioners, I'll concentrate in this presentation on those three elements. The IED study recommends closer alignment with other updated MFI, multi-finance institutions, MFI policies. Can I have the next slide, please? And the gap analysis is being undertaken to really understand better where there are gaps between ADB and other MFIs and where there are synergies. So what I've done in these slides, I've just put on the left-hand slide, as you can, left-hand side of the slide, as you can see, that indicates key points from SPS on stakeholder engagement planning, which is the first topic, compared to corresponding key points from other MFIs on the right-hand side. So, as you know, and as Bruce has pointed out, unlike other MFIs, ADB does not have a standalone policy standard at the moment, which covers the key SEID policy constituents. So the aims, the objectives, the scope of application for planning, grievances and information disclosure are quite scattered throughout SPS, whereas other MFIs have tended, not exclusively, but tended to put them together into one standard. Under SPS, there is no specific policy requirement for preparation of a stakeholder engagement plan, which is called as such under SPS. This is not to say that stakeholder engagement plans aren't prepared. They can be, and they are prepared, but they may be integrated into other required plans, such as an environmental impact assessment or a resettlement plan, or communications and participation plan, just to give you some examples. While it's not required under the SPS, the private sector projects may prepare a stakeholder engagement plan if they're co-financed with other MFIs, or other components have some requirements for a stakeholder engagement plan. But other MFIs clearly state in their stakeholder engagement policy that a plan is required proportionate to the scale and nature of a particular project. The last point, the last key point, is that under SPS there are, as you know, three key safeguards requirements, SRs. One is environmental, one is indigenous peoples, and one is involuntary resettlement. And certainly between the environmental and the social components, they often go their own ways and the synergies are not clearly covered. Whereas in other standards for other MFIs, the environmental and the social dimensions of a single project can be much more clearly integrated, which is very useful. Next slide, please. So information disclosure, this is a very hot topic among many people and organizations. Again, under SPS, information disclosure requirements are fairly varied. The guidance is across SPS, also in its access to information policy, which was developed and endorsed and put into being after SPS, and in its project administration manual. The only specific timeline mentioned under SPS is for a category A draft environmental impact assessment, which is required to be disclosed at least 120 days before board disclosure. And full website disclosure is required for resettlement documentation, but there is no timeline attached to that. Other MFIs require information disclosure to, actually their information disclosure timeline is quite varied as well, although a little bit more systematic, and has further details on the type of information to be disclosed. Information disclosure guidance is in one standard and in its access to information policies for the different MFIs. They all have access to information policies, as does ADB. And the draft ESIA disclosure requirements are 60 to 100 days, depending on the categorization of a project, depending on whether it's public or private as well. So the requirement is for ADB's access to information policy requires clear and timely disclosure, and also lists where exceptions apply. For example, when there is personal information in a resettlement plan, such as the details of land acquisition, individual land acquisition, or where there is commercial or financial interest. But it does not include any timelines for disclosure of documents. So when the IED says that ADB needs to align with other MFIs, I think there needs to be some more discussion on what aspect of alignment is recommended, because it's not consistent across the other MFIs, certainly as far as disclosure is concerned, and the various timelines are variable. So there are two forms of disclosure to consider, and one is the substantive and full disclosure to project stakeholders, affected people, local government, etc. And the second is procedural disclosure, which is required by ADB of its staff before board consideration. Next slide, please. So we would like to have some discussion, and I'm sure there will be plenty of discussion about what timing of disclosure is appropriate and reasonable in the updated policy, and the fact that disclosing on a website may not always be available to affected people, and therefore what methodologies and what systems should be available on the ground in a project. And as for grievance mechanisms, the SPS does not distinguish between formal and informal grievance mechanisms, which is clearly stated in other MFI standalone policies. Anonymous complaints are not mentioned, which are mentioned in other performance requirements. And most importantly, guidance on how to implement a grievance procedure and what it should consist of and how it should be monitored and tracked. It's spread out in many different documents and materials. I counted, I think, about 5 different guidance, separate guidance document for grievance, whereas other MFIs have a clearly linked guidance note on what a grievance is, where it's needed, which performance requirement it's related to, etc., how to monitor it, and it's very much more clearly linked, and this takes precedence instead of relying on several variable sources. Next slide. So there are quite a few topics to consider when updating the SPS and in developing a standalone policy standards. The lead strategy at the moment is a separate policy standard, and it certainly does, for SEID, it does pull together quite a number of disparate factors. So it would look at aligning more closely with other MFI safeguard frameworks, but as well as bridging existing policy gaps for ADB. But also a separate policy standard, which is really helpful, clarifies the overlaps between cross-cutting and thematic areas, such as the overlaps between environmental and social components. It will look at sharpening policy requirements for sovereign and non-sovereign operations. And what has come out in all these discussions so far is the need for good guidance notes and templates on best practice. The establishment of a separate stakeholder engagement plan needs discussion, and whether this should be proportionate to the nature and the scale of a project and its risks and impacts. And this is where the linkages between the performance standards arise again, because the potential risks and impacts will be looked at under another performance standard, or the clarification of the requirements will be discussed in another performance standard. So how do each of the performance standards link to each other to form a coherent body of advice and policy guidance to project implementers and to ADB staff? So a stakeholder engagement plan, one critical element of it obviously is stakeholder identification, and this would look at both formal and informal methods of identifying different types of stakeholders and what their various interests, their primary and their secondary interests in any particular project would involve. Information disclosure and communication, what monitoring system would be suitable, and what kind of stakeholder roles and responsibilities and budgets and resource requirements for training and project implementation. Information disclosure, as mentioned, has been required by, or recommended rather, I would say, by IED study to align with other MFIs for both sovereign and non-sovereign operation, and how to strengthen continuous disclosure to project affected people. And the last slide. Grievance redress mechanisms to be included in the SEID policy standard instead of separately diffused among several policy standards, and customized in a culturally appropriate way for different types of affected people wherever possible, mentioning or requiring the utilization of acceptable and traditional dispute resolution measures, and how to consider and track complaints to ensure that they are dealt with properly. Monitoring is also a very critical issue. I haven't addressed it really fully in this comparison because we have a number of issues to discuss this morning, but it would clarify the requirements for the client or the borrower, how to monitor a stakeholder engagement plan implementation, how to monitor grievance processes, where to make updates in approaches as appropriate. And lastly, guidance materials. This has been a big topic in all our consultations so far, and clearly this is something that is badly needed, with updated and improved guidance toolkits, templates, good practice notes, etc. So Bruce has already mentioned that is happening for grievances, and we need it for other areas as well. So this is a brief presentation of the key points, and I'll now hand over to Azim, who will explain the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Liz. And one of the highlights of Liz and Zaroui's presentations was perhaps a need for a separate policy on SEID. But I just want to thank the presenters again, and thanks also to Bruce for framing and contextualizing the discussion. So there's a number of issues that we're going to be discussing with the facilitation offered by Mr. Gelson Garcia. Before we get into that, you will see some guide questions on the screen, and these are by no means exhaustive. I see that we've already got some questions and comments on the chat, and so it looks like we've got a very lively discussion ahead of us. We hope we can get further feedback from all of you on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas, as well as specifically SEED or SEID. Before we move on to this facilitated Q&A session, let's pause for a 5-minute break. But before actually pausing for that break, may I please ask that, and you will have seen in the chat box, there's a question on Menti, which is an online app that allows stakeholders like yourselves to provide feedback to the ADB on how to improve these particular sessions. So the question is to you as stakeholders, what can the ADB do to improve the facilitation, the dialogue, the feedback, the interaction with key stakeholders like yourselves? Are you satisfied with this particular level of presentation and discourse, notwithstanding the limitations of the pandemic? So, of course, we would all like to have face-to-face, person-to-person dialogue. But because of the limitations of COVID, we can't do that right now. Aside from that, what else can the ADB do to improve your level of satisfaction and your engagement with the ADB on the safeguard policy update process? Are there specific ways that this can be improved? So with that, we'll leave this slide on the screen for now. Take a short 5-minute break. When you see the timer count down or approaching 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screen. If you are moving away from your screen to get an afternoon coffee or drink or something, we will have music playing in the background. So as that music fades down, you'll also know that it's time to return to the screen. But think of a few things while you're away on your break. Think of the guide questions that we have on the screen, and think of the Menti question that we've asked you to consider. So see you all in 5 minutes for a very lively discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome back, everybody. Before we actually get into the moderated or facilitated Q&A session, may I please ask the user Galaxy S20 Plus, sorry, the Urdu or Hindi interpreter is leaking into the main channel here. Thank you, that's much better. May I please ask the user Galaxy S20 Plus to rename yourself or identify yourself? We've sent you several private chat messages, but have had no response. So please just let us know who you are, and welcome, of course, to this consultation. You're very warmly welcomed. So we have a facilitated Q&A session. Some of the guide questions have been posted on the slide that you had during the brief break, but I would now like to call upon our senior stakeholder engagement specialist with Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, and more specifically, the Stakeholder Engagement team, to carry on and carry forward this Q&A session, Mr. Gelson Garcia, who many of you know. Gelson, if you could please start with outlining the order and the way, the methodology in which you will be accepting and taking questions. So over to you, Gelson, please.
Thank you, Azim. Can you confirm if you hear and see me clearly?
I can't see you yet, but I'm sure. Oh, now I can see you and I can hear you very clearly. Thank you, Gelson.
Okay, thank you. So thankful also for the presence of civil society and other non-government actors from Central and West Asia and South Asia. We're happy to be joined by participants from Southeast Asia, East Asia, and other regions too. I want to especially highlight the participation from representatives in Uzbekistan who have 9 registered for this consultation. We hope to hear from you. And also welcome to new faces or relatively new faces in this consultation. I see some points written in chat already by Ryan and seconded by Wawa. So I'd like to call you a little later. Some of you may still be formulating your questions and comments. So let me restate the basics to maximize our conversation. First, the focus. As you can see in the guide questions earlier that had been flashed on your screen, we'd like to structure our conversation around the 3 main components of SEED: the stakeholder engagement, the information disclosure, and the project level grievance redress mechanism. I know many, if not most of you, for many years, who engage independently with the ADB on how critical a robust stakeholder engagement is, both in policy and in practice, not just for safeguards compliance, but also in achieving the expected development outcomes. We know that when it is applied in varying operating environments, whether in low governance or fragile and conflict-affected situations, the principles, objectives, requirements, or the effectiveness of SEED strategy or approach of the MFI would always be put to the test. So it would be useful to hear your recommendations, your first-hand feedback. What should be the requirements? What are the good practices? And I think, frankly, in this conversation, I would also dare to ask, what are the bad ones that shouldn't be repeated or avoided in SEED? Some of you are quite engaged in this topic, but I guess for the sake of others who are relatively new in this technical conversation, but otherwise have felt it in some of the projects that you have yourselves engaged in, I think one top line message from the presentation is, number 1, ADB is considering developing a standalone SEED policy standards, which will be a development, or if you like, a huge leap from the existing approach and requirements on the current policy. And I think the weaknesses that have been presented earlier by Zara. Also, we also would like to hear your specific recommendations or critical feedback about, what are the key components of the SEED. For example, there's a consideration here for preparing a stakeholder engagement plan. So I think the question for you is, when do we need to have this? Or under what project categories it should be needed? And what should go into it? I've seen some civil society comments paper recently that have dealt directly on this, what should be in the SEP. In strengthening the information disclosure, so which is presented by Liz, I think some additional guide questions to consider there will be, in addition to gaps and synergies, it's important to also ask questions about when, the frequency, the translation, what should be critical in the information disclosure, and at what particular project cycle this types of information should really be most effective. And I know that many of you have dealt not just with accountability mechanism, but also at the project level grievance redress mechanism. I know because I have myself in the past quite involved in supporting communities on how to seek redress out grievances at the project level, which is, I know, is always a challenge. But I think some of the guide question to consider here will be, how can we make the project level GRM more accessible, transparent, and ensuring that the use of dispute resolution approach or tools are not just for a show, but really could really deliver acceptable results when dealing with complaints. And of course, if you have any specific recommendations on what should be changed and be made better on the monitoring, and what should really be considered, say, capacity building or better implementation requirements for SEED as it applies to private sector operations should look like. So as you know, we are also being joined by some PSOD staff from ADB who'd also like to hear your thoughts or critical feedback recommendations around SEED in the context of private sector operations. So we have 75 minutes for our session. We can, of course, extend depending on the questions that we receive. Yeah, so when you're ready, please raise your hand or write your questions in chat box, and I will call you accordingly. If you feel more comfortable speaking in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu, please do so. We have interpreters to assist you. So let's begin. I see some points already in chat. So why don't I start with you, Ryan? You have already written there. I like the stats that you presented. And then we can also, if Wawa would like to have some additional points, Wawa, please do come in after Ryan. So Ryan, please.
Thank you, Jolson, and thanks to Bruce and everyone for the initial input. I think before starting off on details and specifics on FIs, one thing which we want to flag as NGO Forum on ADB and civil society is the basic premise from which this consultation is starting off from, and the signals that we are getting from reading the summary report is whether ADB's information disclosure or SEID is in harmony with the other MFIs. I think that has been the principal premise through which ADB is bringing the issues forward, and I noticed that in the PowerPoint presentation as well. But for us, we're closely looking at project-related impacts on the ground on local communities. The question is really not whether the policies are in harmony with each other around stakeholder engagement, but rather is the information reaching the local communities in time so that they can safeguard themselves from project impacts. And I do not see a genuine, sincere effort in that messaging coming forward from the bank, and that's deeply concerning. Now, I want to reiterate this for the overall SPS review, that the reason why this review is happening is to get towards a robust policy, which is going to protect people from harm when ADB operations are going to take place. Now, how do we interpret that? That's up to debate and how we view it, but that should be the primary reason as to why we are talking. When it comes to data itself, we are deeply concerned because we've done our own analysis over the private sector operations department's portfolio. We've dealt with a lot of projects within PSOD. Just a quick rundown on FIs. 99 financial intermediary projects from 2010 to 2020. That's 10 years of FI financing. We've found out that there were only 2 projects that actually released their environmental social management system arrangements, and only 2 gender action plans were released and 2 completion reports were released. Further to that, we investigated 6 particular FIs classified as the energy sector, and we requested directly the bank's information disclosure unit to release ESMS information. And there was only 1 particular FI, Venture Life Fund 3, which released the ESMS arrangement. The remaining 5, Equity Investment, Asia Climate Partners, Industrial Energy Efficiency Finance Program, a loan to Indonesian Exim Bank, I could go on with that list. All of them cited the confidentiality clause, and they said that releasing this information would be a risk to their business interests. So is there leverage between ADB, PSOD, and the FIs on information disclosure? Or are we just talking very superficially here, knowing full well that the FIs are not responding at all on information? And if that's the elephant in the room, then we should just come out and say it, and that there's a deep problem in implementation. So I'll just stop there, and I'm sure Wawa can handle the issue of local grievance redress mechanisms as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Bruce. But before Wawa, I'm sure that you have other additional points too. I'll give the floor to Bruce first, because I think you touched a lot, not just on the information disclosure, but how it relates to PSOD, FIs, in other policy, interlinkages. So, Bruce, how about we start with you? I think you need to unmute, Bruce. Has to unmute.
I'm sorry, I thought I had unmuted it there. I went ahead too quickly. So yeah, thank you very much, Delson. And thank you very much, Ryan Hassan from the NGO Forum for joining. Nice to see you again today. So let me start with your first points about the premise for the consultation and the approach, and then I'll come to the financial intermediaries after, and some of my colleagues might like to also add some points after. Yeah, firstly, I want to assure you, and I feel confident that we're actually here for the same reasons. And I had covered some of these points in my opening remarks as well. We need to ensure through the existing policy and the new policy, importantly, that we provide information disclosure and full and effective stakeholder engagement so that we can avoid impacts to affected people and the environment. I mean, that's really the core of the policy, and that's really what we're seeking to strive for. So with a new policy, we'd like to have, of course, we're looking very closely at what others are doing, but the intention is to strengthen our approach to ensure that we've got timely and adequate information disclosure and timely and appropriate and meaningful consultation with affected stakeholders, affected people, civil society, of course, as part of that process. So that's really what we're aiming for. It's not benchmarking for the sake of that. Of course, we do look at how other multilateral financial institutions are organizing their own systems for several reasons, which I do think are important. One are they are similar types of organizations in terms of the financing and the approach. Two, without many exceptions, most have updated their policies much more recently than the ADB, including the Inter-American Development Bank that was just approved last year, and have gone through various stakeholder consultation processes and approvals by their own board to look at what would be appropriate approaches and best practices, of course, for their own organizations. So we're now, of course, looking you know, we understand the benchmarking, let's see what others are doing. And then of course we need to see what's an appropriate approach for ADB. And that's why we're also here consulting with stakeholders to try and get your feedback. So let's understand what others are doing, but then of course let's look and see what should be right for the ADB. So that's our intent, just to put that into context. Now, secondly, for the financial intermediaries, I think we would agree across our team that you know, the importance of reviewing and working towards strengthening the whole approach for the policy, including for financial intermediaries. We are doing some separate studies on that area, and we'd be very interested to talk to you about the data that you've collected and analysed as part of that process. So maybe as a follow-up, we can have further discussions on those details, and we can bring in also our private sector department who are not necessarily participating today, but we can get into more details. Plus, we're having a separate consultation that we're planning for later this year around different financing modalities, which will include financial intermediaries. So we'll have a chance with the team and a further background study to look at some of those details. But I wanted to cover some points today. You know, firstly, just to clarify a couple of points that you had mentioned. There's a number of pieces of documentation that are actually part of ADB's due diligence. So the initial poverty and social analysis is prepared as part of ADB's due diligence to prepare a project. So that will actually be disclosed by the ADB for the project as a whole, typically. And that's also linked to the disclosure of the report and recommendation of the president. That's always disclosed for any project that's going to the board and always available on our website, along with the project data sheets. But then, of course, with the financial intermediary loans, you then have the authorization for a financial intermediary to disperse money through to sub-borrowers. And that's, of course, you know, where it's so important. And I think that's what you're most concerned about. The environmental and social management systems, for one, it's not clear in the existing policy around a clear requirement for those environmental and social management systems, ESMS, to be disclosed on our website. And actually, we've had debates with our operational colleagues around these points, and it's something that we have to come back to for the policy update. What we do have is within the board documents, our report and recommendation to the president, is you will find in those papers, you will find a summary of the client's existing environmental and social management system. You'll find an audit of that system, and you'll find a gap analysis along with any areas that would need to be strengthened as part of the system itself. And you'll usually find conditions. So what you may find is that if there is strengthening of the system need, you'll find a legal requirement, a condition precedent that system be strengthened and updated satisfactory to ADB before lending. But I recognise the gap around the actual environmental and social management disclosure itself. Now, the access to information policy does have a preference for disclosure, but as you've mentioned, in cases of commercial sensitivity, it may not be disclosed, and that's something that we need to review for the environmental and social management systems. Another thing to mention is that typically for our private sector, and you were talking about private sector data, in the vast majority of projects, we've actually excluded category A projects that would have potential for significant risks. That's because of the more challenging nature of managing financial intermediary loans with category A projects. So typically private sector department is excluding those through legal agreements. So we're dealing with category B and C. But in the cases that there were any category A, they have to be referred back to ADB. They have to be reviewed by our team, and they are posted on our website, but usually we're not doing them because of the risks involved. So there's a lot of issues involved in the financial intermediaries that we do need to look at more and that we're aware of. And I say from our team, it's an area that we need to strengthen and discuss further. So look, thanks for raising that. And as I said, we'd be happy to have further discussions on your data and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Before I go back to Ryan, talking about the financial intermediary, we know that this is also part of the consultations that are scheduled in April 25 and 27, which is consultations on financing modalities, and certainly FIs is one of those subtopics for discussion around information disclosure and safeguards also. But Ryan, anything to respond to Bruce?
No, thank you, Bruce. I know it's a lot of hard work at this point to find a solution to the FI information disclosure problem. But I would probably just flag one more issue, and these are real situations on the ground, like the Kolkata Environmental Improvement Project. And the reason why local communities were not getting compensated was because they did not make the list. Boiled down to one consultation which took place in a marketplace, which only had representatives from a particular marketplace and not the actual people who are street vendors. If you look at the Tanahu project, the issue was that project-related information and environmental impacts and social impacts from the hydropower dam were not explained properly to the local communities. They just didn't realize how much they would be affected and what that would mean for asset loss. So there is a marriage here between stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. These two things cannot be seen in silos. And if these two things are meaningfully done, then the local communities are aware of the risks entailed in a project, and then they can come into the negotiation table and have a much more constructive discussion moving forward. The resistance is happening because people are just being left in the dark over what the information the project holds, and the stakeholder consultation just takes place without any information, which leads to the power dynamic issue coming in, and you see resistance forming. So this has to be rectified, especially for projects like sovereign projects where the ADB machinery has leverage and has longstanding membership and relationship with the governments to make things better. And I'll just stop there. I think that's enough food for thought on the due diligence aspect of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. And I don't think that you are looking for an immediate response to this, no? But certainly that can also be part of the continuing discussion, if not today, after. Thanks. May I now call our participant from Uzbekistan, Ms. Madina. After her, we'll have Himanta and then Romi. So let's start with you, Madina.
Thank you very much, Gelson, and good day, everyone. And first of all, thank you, ADB, for organizing such kind of the very useful consultation, and we are glad to make a contribution in the process of improvement the SPS policy. I just wanted to say that I work as an environmental specialist in Uzbekistan, and I work not only with ADB, but with other MFIs like World Bank, EBRD, and IFC. Therefore, I have a chance to compare practice which presents on which are applying for stakeholder engagement plan and GRM with other institutions. And I also confirmed that the ADB has a different practice, slightly different practice. And first, as I wrote in my message to the chat, I wanted to say that regarding the PFIs, I don't think that only 2 ESMS was published, by the way, because in Uzbekistan, I know 3 ESMS was published on ADB website, because we have a number of FI projects in Uzbekistan, and at least it has 3 of them have a ESMS. And you mentioned that another special session, separate session, will be dedicated to FI, and I'm sure that banks, our PFIs, will be very active because Uzbekistan banks, they receive a lot of loans from different MFIs, and their main concern to try to unify the requirements. They also raise the question there are different requirements from ADB side, from World Bank and EBRD side. But I think let's leave it for next session, which will be in April. What kind of improvements or suggestion I have for stakeholders engagement activities? Just wanted to, I would like to suggest you to make a list of stakeholders which have to be consulted. We are talking a lot about affected people. It's very important, but from environment point of view, we have to make sure that all relevant NGOs or agencies have been consulted. So, and first we have to make a list of the consultant stakeholders which have to be consulted, and make sure that information disclosure consultation have been done together with them. So all participants have been, I mean, relevant agencies, NGOs, and people have been consulted. So it's a plus to the affected people, for sure. It's also important, but we have number of projects where I just would like to underline that consultation with these agencies is also important. And next question, we are talking about the new policy for stakeholder engagement. And I'm sure you're also aware that for other MFIs, social and environmental impact assessment usually go as a one process. Sometimes it's very difficult to separate social environmental activity, especially in terms of preparations, this stakeholder engagement plan. And our policy, for example, when we social and environmental experts are working as individual experts. So it's sometimes difficult to coordinate work. And I'm just thinking, who will prepare this plan, stakeholder engagement plan? It will be prepared by environmental specialists, or it will be prepared by social experts, social specialists. So, why I'm asking, because for other MFIs like IFC, EBRD, World Bank, usually one firm is preparing the document, and it's a list of documents including environmental social impact assessment, stakeholder engagement plan, land restoration, etc. So, and here I have a concern, whose responsibility will be, and it will be separate specialist who will work on this, or it will be part of the environmental or social expert. So this is a concern and question and a suggestion regarding the mandatory list of stakeholders which have to be included in the information disclosure process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Medina. I'd like to call in Madhu and also Zaruhi to respond to your question on a point on engaging other stakeholders. How is actually ADB engaging the other stakeholders as part of the stakeholder engagement plan? And also Zaruf or maybe Madhu to respond to who gets involved in the development of the ESMS. I know this is like basics, but it might be good to again reiterate what ADB is doing under the current policy and what can be done differently or better in the next policy. So Madhu, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you, Jelson. I think the most important thing that the new policy would be that we're thinking of a stakeholder engagement standard. And I think that's a big move because currently the policy, the requirements are dispersed across the various standards, as my colleague, earlier during the presentation explained. So with the standard, what we are really trying to do is outline what are the key elements of a stakeholder engagement plan, starting from stakeholder mapping, identification, analysis, modes and methods of consultation, messaging, documentation, feedback, disclosure. So how all of these things would work. we obviously, our policy, as you know, applies to all lending modalities. So we would also, we'll also have a session on the different lending modalities, and I'm sure during that time, the disclosure will also come up for respective lending modalities. I think one of the key questions you asked was, if we have to prepare a stakeholder engagement plan, whose responsibility would it be? Now, all the MFI, when we did the benchmarking, most of the MFIs prepare a stakeholder engagement plan, which is scaled as per the impacts and risks of the project. Now, in terms of the way ADB actually does its business, hires TRTA consultants, before it was called PPTA consultants, who would do the job, because we have environment specialists as well as social specialists. I think from the top of the mind, I can say that we are also looking for integrated risk assessment and moving out from this separate risk categorization. That does not mean that we will not look at each of the standards and see what the risks are in each of them. Definitely yes, but at least an integrated risk-based classification where we are able to also allocate resources. So if we assess that we need a very detailed stakeholder engagement plan, automatically at the stage of the concept, when the proposal is prepared for ADB financing, such resources will be allocated. And now in terms of both social safeguards and environment specialists, they have their specializations and they have to work together. Coordination, that part has to work. And in order to ensure that this thing happen actually during implementation of the new policy, as you know, SPS SPRU, the SPRU process is also trying to prepare and will prepare a rollout capacity building training program, both for ADB staff, DMC, as well as our consultants. And I hope having all these processes together, we would be able to ensure that we have a proper stakeholder engagement planning and then implement that throughout the project cycle. I'll stop there, Jelson, and hand over to Zara if she has to add points.
Yes, it does look like she is fine with what you responded so far. But Medina, I wanted to check if you have any follow-up to your points earlier or response to Madhu.
Let's wait for Zara reply. Actually, as I understand, still I'm not a little bit clear. So it means that that part, it will be part of IE, right? Stakeholder engagement activities. Am I correct? Or environmental impact assessment, or whatever will be prepared?
There was always stakeholder consultation, both for social safeguards and environment, that will remain. I don't think there will be any changes, but what we really need to do is allocate additional resources. We have not taken the full and final decision. We are still exploring. So as and when you join consultations, maybe at a later stage, maybe at the time of preparation, when we share information on the working paper of the policy, we'll have more clear view of how we would want to execute that. I just gave you just from the top of my mind, but this also has to be discussed internally, how the system would work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Medina. I think these are very important questions to ask as we develop the SEP. I want to move to Himanta.
Thank you very much, Jelson. Of course, the three areas that we are talking today, stakeholder engagement, grievance redress mechanism, and information disclosure, that comes with a proper process. I think the countries, when we are defending the local communities, we are not very happy with the local processes, the EIA process. It is perhaps old, not implementing properly, and there are many gaps in this process. So that is why we are looking for the ADB to have a better safeguards, better mechanisms, better grievance mechanisms, etc. But when it comes to the 2009 policy, the entry point is avoid, minimize, compensate. Now, avoid actually means that you're avoiding many of the category A projects. Now, when you avoid all those category A projects, that actually leads the Chinese finances or maybe other bilaterals to come with their financing, and that's the biggest problem at the moment in many of our countries, because they don't have any safeguards. They come with their easy money, and when they implement the same projects or the connected projects to, for example, Southern Transport Development Project, we had the JBIC part, we had the ADB part, then we had the Chinese part. When it goes to the Chinese section, there's no such safeguards at all. Now, when again within the ADB also you have the financial intermediaries, which most of them don't go through this policy. So when you remove the category A projects and when you remove the financial intermediary, what percentage of projects we are talking which is this SPS actually relevant today? So I think it could be maybe about 50%, or I don't know what percentage actually. Now our issue is now avoid is actually when during the 2009 policy, when that team brought this avoid term, I think we were very happy. But unfortunately, that avoid actually leads for dirty money to come and implement more bad projects without safeguards. So that's one of the issue. Now, when it comes to the meaningful consultation, how effective this actually, we have few experiences in Sri Lanka. Now, for example, Mana Wind Power, under the local process, we had only initial environmental examination. When it goes to the Asian Development Bank, so they push for a environmental impact assessment. As a result, we were able to bring this the radar system to shut down, emergency shut down all these wind turbines, etc. Again in Upper Araha Canal project, so we have all this limited disclosure. I think current problem is actually the improper implementation of the existing provisions. I think that's something we have to understand when we are making. How do you make a policy that can implement in any situation in any of these countries, especially the repressive, when there are repressive governments? I think so there's a problem for, I mean, at the moment, many of the countries are going through this lack of civil society space, which Wawa already raised. I think that has to make sure that the simplified grievance mechanism, simplified information disclosure, and stakeholder engagement comes in you can implement in any sort of a situation. Again, I think the grievance redress mechanism, and when it comes to the Southern Transport Development Project, which many of us know very well, there was a very good redress mechanism. But when it comes to the other similar road projects, highway projects in Sri Lanka, there's no such effective grievance redress mechanisms. Now here, when it comes to the local communities, whether they are living along the Southern Transport Development Corridor or Central Development Corridor, we all have the same equal rights before the Constitution, before the law. And that should be the ADB or whatever the finances comes to Sri Lanka, or they also have to treat everyone equally. But because the national and at the national level, we don't have a respect to these kind of redress mechanisms, and we have a different sort of mechanisms, and that will somehow badly or negatively impact certain communities, while certain communities may have a better grievance mechanism. So I want to have a understanding about how we can have a equal ensure equal rights to all these affected communities without depending on who is actually funding. So that is where I think if the ADB this time is going to look at other financial institutions like the World Bank or EBRD, etc., okay, that's a good approach, I believe. But at the same time, how do you make sure that bilateral funding, especially the money comes from China or some other countries, have the same kind of respect to the local people. So that's my submission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Himanta. Please don't mute yet, because I have a challenge for you, my friend. Because I know that you gave us a number of points there to consider, but I do not want to assume that I got everything that you said. But I know that you mentioned about the importance of avoidance. Where is it now in the ADB policy? Also about ensuring equal protection to affected people. It does not matter who's funding it or under what financing modality. And then ensuring the seed actually takes place, ensuring meaningful consultation, information disclosure, especially in the context like Sri Lanka and other operating environments. So I wanted to make sure that I capture some of the gist there, but if there's anything that you would like to reiterate in the form of a question, that would be useful.
I think the first question is clear because of the avoidance of certain projects. Especially I find the independent evaluation department report also mentioned about that the category A projects there are less number of category A projects, but where those category A projects are now going, it is going to the bilateral money, especially in Sri Lankan case, it's mostly the Chinese money is coming in that way. So I think it's very clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So on that note, I'm going to call Bruce to start responding or elaborating.
Sure. Thank you, Gelson. And thank you, Himanta, for joining. It's great to have your experience and perspectives. Actually, you've raised many important points, and it'd be great to have a bit more of a dialogue actually on just this aspect. But let me try to respond on some of the points. Firstly, the portfolio and the IED did deal with this during the evaluation. Typically, we have about 10% of our projects on an annual basis that would be category A for environment, similar for involuntary resettlement. For Indigenous peoples, though, it's much less, and it can be as low as 1% category A, which is a good thing in some ways that we're not having projects that have significant adverse impacts on Indigenous peoples, but also the evaluation department did point to the fact that there was likely some avoidance there of projects, avoiding triggering those projects that would have significant risks. Financial intermediaries, by the way, are about 10% on an annual basis, although that's the proportion of projects. I don't have the financial figures with me here, but to your point though, where the portfolio from the ADB side is taking on less risk, yes, that may mean that the government or other financiers are stepping in to pick up that space. And I think that is likely to happen increasingly in the infrastructure space, especially as we pivot towards more green recovery and focusing on being a climate bank and supporting education and health. Then there may be less rationale for us to be doing some of the primary infrastructure work, which was typically the category A projects. So who's financing them and what safeguards are they applying? Now, there's a number of thoughts here with this, and the arguments often do come up that it may be better to be involved in the project because we can bring more robust safeguards, as you've pointed out. There are, of course, cases where we have stepped away from projects because we see significant risks that we don't think, can be adequately addressed, and it's better for us to stay away from them. But yet I have seen those projects go ahead and you've got concerns about them. So I think that's certainly an issue. Now, how do we get around that? I think there's a few things, perhaps not perfect. One is that the harmonization agenda, and I do think this is important. This relates also back to some of Ryan Hassan's earlier comments, but I didn't mention this, I'll mention it now. One of the benefits of greater convergence between the multilateral financial institutions is to try and create internationally good practice standards. And I don't mean here sort of, a race to the bottom. I mean really pushing the standards up to where they can be, as strong as they can be, and still be practically implemented. That allows us to have something consistent, which we can promote across industry and for which we can all converge for capacity building with governments. That capacity development is the other aspect of this that really has to be pushed. We have to build their systems, and then we have to support better implementation, and that links also to our strengthened role that I think is necessary for monitoring and supervision and ensuring good practices are applied, like for the Grievance Redress Mechanisms. But it's often not an easy choice, and I do think within ADB, sometimes there are our mission leaders that would prefer to stay away from those complex projects and minimize the risks and maybe speed up the processing time. Another point linked to this also is something we're taking a look at, which is associated facilities. You mentioned the need for equality. The laws need to be applied equally, and something that often concerns us is when you might say have, let's say, a project that's got different affected people. We may be financing a certain section or a certain proportion of the project which is applying, say, our standards. Maybe for involuntary resettlement, we're ensuring that informal settlers are getting compensation for livelihoods and structures, whereas under some governments they wouldn't get anything for that. And then you can have stakeholders that are affected living near to each other but are getting different safeguards applied to them, which is, from an individual perspective, clearly not the right thing to do. But if we're not financing, can we have leverage? Sometimes with associated facilities we can push, but sometimes we can't. So I think that's another angle. But look, Hemantha, thank you again. There are a lot of things that we could touch on for your points, and happy to hear more from you on this. Thank you.
Jason, you are muted.
I'm sorry. Yes, Hemantha, would you like to do as a follow-up to that, or you would like me to move to the other?
Yeah, I think thank you for that explanation. I think I was thinking about that. I mean, you have been talking about these country systems, agency systems for many years. We had some concerns before. Of course, if you asked me about 4 or 5 years ago, I would have opposed to country systems. But right now, I'm thinking about, because some of those funders are doing a lot of harm to our communities, whether pushing for a country system is something good. I don't know whether this is the opportunity for us because you are comparing the policies with the other banks. Then if you still bring the bilateral funding as well, and then push for at least some of those national governments to go for the country system, would that give a equal safeguards to all the communities across the country? I think so. That is the addition I want you to consider.
Thanks, Hemantha. In fact, I think you probably know already that on April 4 to 6, we have consultation specific to country safeguard system. I also just posted in chat the link for people to also register, just basically for FYI. But Bruce or maybe Mike, would you like to come in here with regards to country system?
Yeah, I can cover just very briefly. So we will have a consultation on that, and are keen to get further inputs on that topic. Firstly, the existing approach and the policy that we've had around the accreditation of countries for the use of country safeguard systems based on their equivalence and acceptability has, well, depending on your perspectives, you'd say not really succeeded. We've only accredited one agency after assessments in a number of countries. And while we very committed and would like to increase resources for strengthening country systems, I think the goal of accrediting nationally is going to be quite challenging, because there are always differences between the frameworks. So I think that remains something that we, of course, will be looking into further, but I think it's a challenge. Application, though, for more circumscribed project situations may be more feasible and where you can adequately manage risks a bit more effectively. What I mean here is that, let's say there's a government or an agency that has got good systems in place, or systems that can be strengthened further to be good and robust systems. You can review and accredit those, but then you want to actually apply it in a known situation. So you're not just accrediting them to use it in any and all projects, which can have all sorts of risks. But you're saying, for this particular project, given the risk profile, the potential impacts, and the need for management measures, could you apply it at that level? But that, again, has some pros and cons. So there's a lot to think about with the strengthening of CSS, but I would like to collaborate comprehensively with other financial institutions and also with civil society around really pushing to help build country systems and build country capacity and expertise, because that's what we need to see in the end, is really good country systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Himantha and Bruce. I know that this topic will continue to be discussed in April, so hopefully we can see you there. In the interest of time also, I would like to suggest that we have another 10 minutes left for the Q&A. And so for those who haven't spoken yet, now is the time to raise your hand or write your questions in chat. So now, thank you so much, Aromi, for patiently waiting. It's your turn. So may we hear from you, please?
Thanks, Jelson. And I was glad to hear Bruce earlier mention the inclusion of persons with disabilities and young people, as well as addressing sexual abuse and exploitation in particular. And as BIC, we've submitted recommendations to the SPRU, so I won't go too much into detail on that today. But I just wanted to highlight some specific asks that we have, and also based on the discussion today about strengthening GRM and the stakeholder engagement process. So I'll be sort of recommending from a disability rights and child rights point of view. So we recommend that the SPS promote non-discrimination and the inclusion of persons with disabilities from the earlier stages of project conceptualization and design, as well as stakeholder engagement and all forms of the consultations, and that all these project documents, and including those relevant to the GRM, should add very specific references to accessibility measures or the formats that the borrower should use based on the various needs of persons with disabilities. So we recommend that the ADB avoid very broad language, such as, accessible format and language, but move forward, move further and give very specific language that addresses sort of the way that the presentation of the information and the documents should be designed and developed. So for example, whether it's physical, whether it's accessible to all types of disabilities, whether it's physical, so looking at infrastructure, looking at visual, auditory, and other available formats, looking at intellectual disabilities and making documents available in simple language, and also looking at psychosocial disabilities, and then looking to see how all those needs can be addressed, and people with disabilities meaningfully, how can they engage right throughout the project cycle. And why we are recommending that these are specifically addressed in the SPS itself is that if you integrate the disability rights throughout the SPS and throughout the project cycle, it also allows for the budgets to reflect costs, and that would enable the full participation of persons with disabilities. And by cost, we mean things, for example, support like the sign language, documents that would adjust for these needs, support for personal assistants and for caregivers, so on and so forth.
Iromi, I think we lost you. Iromi? Okay. So it looks like we lost Romy or May. Can I ask our colleague, I think we have to start with Madhu to start responding to it, and also Zara, because I know that these are very detailed recommendations. We have seen their submissions, and some of this would be a question of what goes into the requirements, which one goes into the guidance notes, and what are the budgetary implications like this. So may I ask Madhu to start with this, and then Zara?
Yeah. Thanks, Hiromi. These are very detailed recommendations, and definitely we are going to consider during the policy formulation process. Just to mention that we are also thinking in terms of, as you know, in the current SPS, the definition of vulnerable groups is not so clear. So firstly, to bring clarity. Secondly, to ensure vulnerability assessment happens. So the issue that you have raised on disability rights and child rights, that's where it will come up. And also in the risk classification, where we'll also do contextual risk assessment. There are also various ways these issues would come up in the ADB project cycle, is that we have the initial poverty social assessment. As Bruce mentioned, that's ADB's due diligence. That is followed by a poverty social assessment, where all the population groups are, are identified in a project area, and also the different socioeconomic information, as well as the kinds of vulnerability they have. Currently, we are trying to also strengthen that process. So issues that you have raised are captured, and they're dealt with right away from the project cycle, starting from identification, the kind of mitigation measures, what needs to be done, and then following through, when we talk about the standards, what kind of information sharing, disclosure that needs to be done. The point is, yes, the policy should have specific references, but we cannot put an entire prescriptive list. So there would be some key things in terms of identification, vulnerability assessment, protection, mitigation. These will be there. But when it comes to details, what would happen under a particular kind of disability would better fit in the guidance notes, as well as detailed guidance, as well as internally ADB also would have their operation manual, and we'll have staff instructions where things will be actually laid out when it comes to identification of vulnerable groups. So that's basically the schematic plan currently we have, but it was really good to hear those specific recommendations. And I'm sure that during the formulation of the different standards, we will take note of the comments that you already provided. If that answers your question, I might also ask Zara if she wants to step in and add a few points to that.
Thanks, Madhu. Zara said, I think she's already fine with what you responded. And also, I think also in the interest of time, we have exhausted, I would say, 80 minutes. I just wanted also to recognize that there were questions like avoidance or a stakeholder analysis, who gets involved in the development of the SEP, which have also been addressed by our ADB colleagues in the chat box. So you probably have seen them already. And also, Iromi, you have also finished what you were supposed to say in chat box. So it's well noted. So I'm not going to summarize what we have heard in this consultation. It's Bruce's role, but I just wanted to thank you for all your constructive and insightful feedback. And some of this certainly suggests that the discussion on stakeholder engagement, information disclosure, and GRM are part and parcel of all the safeguard standards and cross-cutting issues that need to be addressed in the new safeguard policy. And as such, I would encourage you to also attend other related safeguard policy consultations in the coming months, including the country safeguard system and financing modalities, because these are quite related. So again, thank you so much for all your for staying put, but please don't go away yet, because I'm going to ask my colleague Azim to get your feedback via Menti chat and give us your satisfaction rating on how we did in this consultation. So Azim, back to you. If Azim's still there.
Sorry, yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that, Jelson. I apologize. I didn't have my video or audio on. So Jelson, Zaruhi, Liz, Bruce, as well as, of course, contributions from Madhumita Gupta and Mike Beecham working behind the scenes. Thank you all for your inputs and guidance, and especially thank you to those who asked, provoked, probed, and challenged some of us to respond. Those are very much appreciated, especially in the manner in which they were done, which is very, very collegial and certainly much appreciated. So thank you for the clarity, the insights, the sharing of experiences, and the constructive nature in which the feedback occurred. I'd like to reiterate that the comments on stakeholder engagement and the issue of greater integration on the standard as being an enabler we received from this consultation and thereafter will be, of course, considered in the final study report, which will, in turn, inform the revision of ADB's SCID standard and the updating of the policy statement. But as Jelson mentioned, don't go yet. On your screen, please give us your feedback on how effective this consultation was. We have two polls. The first is a Zoom poll, which you're seeing now on your screen. So please give us a rank between 1 to 5 on how effective or satisfied you were with this consultation. Is it a 5, which is the highest you can score? Is it a 1, which is the lowest you can score, or somewhere in between? And then, as you've seen in the chat box, tell us why you scored that and how we can improve these consultations. How specifically can we augment, improve, embellish, make more effective or efficient the way we engage with stakeholders, the way we engage with participants such as yourselves, to get more robust feedback and greater clarity on what you want to see in the final policy statement. So if you could just go to the Zoom poll now, give us a rank, and before I hand you back to Mr. Bruce Dunn to give us a summary, a wrap-up, and an indication of what we can look forward to between now and April 2022, I'd like to read you out the results of the Zoom poll. So that would be very, oh, here we go. 89%, let's say 90% have said we've got a very favorable, highly satisfied, or somewhat satisfied response from you. 11% are neutral, and the ADB recognize, as do those of us who are putting on this consultation, that there is always room for improvement. So please tell us how specifically we can improve these consultations on the Mentee poll. And with that, I'd like to turn you over back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a summary as well as what we can look forward to between now and April. Bruce, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Azim. And thanks so much to all of the participants, especially those that have been sharing their views, raising their hands and speaking, or putting comments in the chat box. It's always greatly appreciated, as are those written submissions and indeed some of the studies that have been referred to today. So very pleased. And in fact, we're very happy to discuss specific submissions from stakeholders so that we can get into further details bilaterally. We had a lot of ground covered today, and a lot of quite wide and of course complex issues still to think through. I've got a list of about 12 main points I just want to include in the summary, but of course we will be capturing a further wider summary of this session, which we'll be sharing back with stakeholders. The recordings are also made available in full through our website. We're in the process actually of uploading from the past consultations and finalizing some of the summaries from the past consultations. We've got a few to catch up on there, so we're aiming to get those out fairly soon. Now, for the summary today, I want to start by just saying that we do have the right intention here. Our goal is really to ensure that our projects do not adversely affect people or the environment, and that we see that stakeholder engagement and the processes that we've been discussing today as being crucial and central to that process. So, strengthening information disclosure, strengthening stakeholder engagement, strengthening grievance redress mechanisms, that's really critical to the process. Of course, we're benchmarking with other multilateral financial institutions to understand their processes as sister organizations that have similar business processes, but that's not a goal into itself. It allows us to understand their policy frameworks and to benchmark potential gaps and areas that we need to strengthen on, but equally as important is the feedback we receive from you. Down to some other points. Ryan Hastan kicked off also with shining a light on the need for strengthened processes for financial intermediaries and mentioning some data from their studies. Some key points from that was around disclosure of key documents, the financial institutions, environmental and social management systems, and other safeguarded due diligence documents. And we've noted also there that these are areas that we've got under review. We agree there's scope for further strengthening to improve those. And we're looking at having a separate consultation. Actually, that's already been scheduled. Next point was clearly the need for a safe space for civil society and, of course, for people. This was mentioned in the context that we, for this session, are promoting the need for a safe space and to make sure it's free of intimidation. But there's risks and also some suggestions of actual intimidation occurring in some projects, which I noted is not something we would endorse or want to see in our projects, and something that we'd like to cover clearly in the new policy coverage around ensuring that there is no coercion, intimidation, retaliation. Next, there was some specific mention about role of military and police. So obviously that can be part of an intimidation approach, but there can also be legitimate uses of security forces in some contexts, particularly fragile and conflict-affected situations. But we also need to look at the appropriate use of those security forces and minimizing risks. And we didn't really talk about the details here, but this has many implications. For example, risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We've seen cases from the World Bank, for example, in Africa, where use of security forces have been linked to this. So this is something in our minds that needs to be addressed. We talked about the introduction of requirements for specific stakeholder engagement planning. And we've heard from quite a number of stakeholders today in this session around the need for better information disclosure, how that has to be linked to the stakeholder engagement process, which we've acknowledged and we need to work on more. Stakeholder mapping is a key part of this, identifying who are the relevant stakeholders and how to engage with them effectively. And this includes also civil society and affected people and a broad range of others. That whole process needs to be more effective. Information needs to be disclosed in a form that's clearly accessible and understandable and relevant, but provided at the right time, so that people can use that information. They have to understand how projects impact on them and what sort of compensation they can receive. And they need to feel that their inputs into the process will actually be meaningfully acknowledged and appropriately addressed through project design, mitigation and management systems. So, you know, all of these areas are incredibly important and are really at the heart of this issue. We also had mention about social and environmental assessment processes and the need to make sure that there are greater linkage between the environmental and social assessments and the need for environmental and social specialists to work together. Sorry, mate, just wait a second. Just got my son joining me. It's maybe past bedtime. I'll just continue. Just wait on a second, mate. Where was I? Okay, we talked a bit about inclusion of vulnerable groups. We need to have clearer definition and engagement with all forms of vulnerable groups. Madhu spoke about this, but we heard also very specifically from Hiromi Pereira from the Bank Information Center about people with disabilities, identification of them, consideration of that there are people with different types of disabilities that would need to be considered appropriately in consultation processes, in grievance redress mechanisms, with documentation, etc. So we appreciated that and appreciated also the submission that we've received from BIC. Didn't get into the details today, but engagement with children and youth. I've got one standing next to me actually, so I understand that one as well. Functioning of grievance redress mechanisms, also critical. That came up a number of times today. They need to be tailored to the needs of affected people, the local context, vulnerability, etc. We touched on strengthening country systems and capacity, and we'll be doing further consultations on that topic. Just a minute, mate. Yeah, we can have that. Strengthening country systems, we'll be doing a further consultation session on. I'd note there also that, you know, really building country systems, building their capacity, and this area is going to undertake or require additional resources and expertise, and that's something we'd like to plan for in the rollout of the new policy, but also as part of our, you know, general work and projects. And then lastly, I've mentioned something that came through in the chat around the need for clear and binding requirements for borrowers and clients. And I've mentioned in the chat also there that two aspects of the policy we're looking at. One is the policy for ADB, our commitment and due diligence, which will be binding on ADB and will be linked to our own staff instructions, which are binding on staff, as well as clear standards, objectives and requirements for borrowers, which obviously need to be fleshed out with sufficient detail, and that would be binding. And then, of course, we see the need for supportive guidance and good practice notes, which should be adapted to the situation. So a lot of things covered today, and actually this session's been quite complementary to other consultations. This is actually the fourth on this topic, and we'll be doing one more tomorrow for stakeholders in the US and Europe. So we'll be hearing more there, and welcome anyone who wants to join again. Now, the outputs of this, as I said, we'll be documenting, but then it will feed into the update of the analytical studies. We'll be making those public after including recommendations from stakeholders and further analysis on our own side, and that will feed into the policy update itself. So thanks again for joining today. Really appreciate all of your feedback, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again. Please do stay safe. It's very challenging times at the moment with COVID and Omicron surging in many parts of the world. So, you know, we do hope you can take care and your families as well. And of course, many of you are working from home, so we appreciate your time today. So thanks again, and that concludes the session today. Good night. Thank you.